Paper and introduce our panel, who I assume we have somewhere. Yes.
We're here somewhere.
You're here somewhere. All right. Who are? In the center, Jim Baggott, a freelance science writer and author who got a doctorate in chemical physics at Oxford, worked at Stanford and in the University of Reading in England, and then has done various business consultancy and training activities, as well as communicating, working on scientific communication. He's written a number of books on contemporary physics, philosophy, and science history, including Higgs, The Invention and Discovery of the God Particle, and Farewell to Reality, How Fairy Tale Physics Betrays the Search for Scientific Truth. Jim will be moderating a conversation between Peter Galison on the left, who is the Joseph Pellegrino University Professor of the History of Science and of Physics at Harvard University, an eminent scholar of the history of science, and in particular the history of physics. Among his books are How Experiment End, Einstein's Clocks and Poincaré's Maps, and Objectivity. And on the right, Brian Greene, who is so well known that as to need no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. He's professor of physics and mathematics at Columbia University, widely known for his discoveries in string theory and its connections to mathematics. Also, as a spectacular communicator of science, his books, The Elegant Universe, The Cosmos, and The Hidden Reality are, I think, known to all of us, and he is, with Tracy Day, one of the co-founders of the World Science Festival. So, Brian, Jim, Peter, please proceed.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope you're enjoying the day. We're here, I guess, because we're reaching a singular moment in the historical development of physics and in some other aspects, science in general, where we really are having to ask ourselves searching questions about what we mean by evidence. And this discussion has really been set up to explore some of the issues that are involved in that. And Brian is well known to you as a string theorist who's been prolific in putting forward views about what modern contemporary physics has to say about the way we should be thinking about the nature of the reality that we live in. Peter is a science historian who's been watching events unfold in physics for many, many years. This discussion comes at the end of a day's symposium where we've also been looking at aspects of the nature of evidence and some of the challenges that we face. Now, this is a general discussion. We're going to keep it light. We're going to keep it fairly easy and fun, I hope. I have to say this is not scripted. We could talk for 10 minutes and dry up, in which case there'll be 50 minutes of Q&A. I'm hoping that that's not going to happen. So if you want to ask a question, if you hear Brian say something, or me say something, or Peter say something, and you feel, actually, I want to know a little bit more about that, please feel free to put your hand up or use the mic. So questions of the type that I'd like to agree with everything that Jim has just said are perfectly fine. We'll take as many of those as we possibly can through the course of the discussion. But no, honestly, feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to hopefully manage the time so that we have about 20, 25 minutes or so towards the end of this session so that you can ask questions. Thinking a little bit about how I'd like to get this discussion started, it's real interesting because within the last couple of years, we've seen some unprecedented developments in fundamental physics. And by that, I mean the fundamental physics that underpins our understanding of elementary particles and the fundamental physics that underpins our understanding of the universe and the way that it's evolved since the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. And I guess what I'd quite like to do is really just ask a question generally to either of these guys. Okay, so let's just look back at the discovery of the Higgs boson. What does that tell us about the standard model of particle physics? There's some question marks over the recent announcement of information regarding a project called BICEP2 and its interpretation in terms of what it's telling us about inflationary Big Bang cosmology. And just explore a little bit. Okay, so these are headline news. This is stuff that's really relevant and important because it's telling us some fundamental things about the nature of the world we live in. Let's just explore some of the issues around the nature of the evidence that's being presented. Okay, so tell us something about the Higgs, Brian.
Sure. Well, we can just start off. Maybe I just ask, how many people know the basic idea of what the Higgs is? Is that something we can just dispense with? And who, maybe the other direction, who has no real idea of what the Higgs is? Let's see. One's my sister. That's worth 2 votes. So in sort of 20 seconds, just the history of it. You know, back in the 60s, people were trying to answer a fundamental question, which is where does heft, where does mass come from? You know, you push on any object, it resists your push. That's the mass of the object. Where does it come from, especially when you're not talking about a big object like this, but the ingredients, the electrons, the fundamental particles, the quarks. Where does their heft, where does their mass come from? And a kind of crazy-sounding idea was put forward by a number of people. It's usually associated with Peter Higgs and Francois Englert, but others too, that mass comes from the following idea, that space is filled with a substance. Not perfect analogy, but kind of a molasses-like substance. And as particles try to speed up through the substance, they experience a resistance. You know, just like if you threw a pebble into a vat of molasses, it would go down slowly because the molasses is resisting the motion of the pebble. Similarly, particles feel a resistance as they try to go through the stuff, and that's where their mass comes from. The stuff called the Higgs field. And now to the question, how would you test this idea? Well, you smash particles together, say at a big machine like the Large Hadron Collider, smash these protons together, and the theory, the mathematics, tells us that a certain fraction of the time, those collisions will kind of jiggle this molasses-like Higgs field, if it's real, and jiggle it in the right way to kind of fleck off a little speck of it. And that little speck would be the Higgs boson, the Higgs particle. And the announcement, July 4th, 2012, was that enough evidence, we can discuss what that means in more detail if you'd like, but enough evidence from the detectors, these mammoth detectors surrounding the Large Hadron Collider, the actual tunnel, had found evidence that this particle, the Higgs particle, had been produced.
So the Higgs boson is the kind of last missing ingredient in a structure called the Standard Model of Particle Physics. We kind of know the identities and the properties of all of the other particles that make up this structure. The issue, and the reason that I think this is interesting to be talking about this right now, is that Peter Higgs' seminal paper, Francois Englert and Robert Brout effectively published papers back in 1964 proposing this idea. And maybe, Peter, you could give us some sense as to, in terms of the way that fundamental physics has developed in this way, is it really true that we're having to learn to be a lot more patient than ever before?
Well, in many ways, the 20th century exemplifies this issue in lots of ways. I mean, general relativity was invented by Einstein in its final form in 1915. There were some indications, like bending starlight, that probed certain aspects of this, but the heyday of experimental general relativity is quite recent, many decades after its invention. And sometimes it does require a certain amount of patience. You want some clues along the way to keep you, some breadcrumbs to keep you going, but I think that's something that does take place over the long term, especially as theory is probing domains where there are many steps between the theory and what you actually see. Another feature of the Higgs that's interesting is that, like many discoveries in particle physics, you start with trying to show something exists. And then there's a stage where you show it exists, but you want to know its properties. And then you know its properties, and you make it into a tool to look at other things. So not that long ago, in the greater scheme of things, the particles that held a weak force together, the Z, was you had to figure out if it existed, then to figure out its properties. And now it becomes a tool. It's part of the probing mechanism to look at the Higgs, to look at decays into particles like the Z. So I think that's something that was true of the neutrino. Did it exist? And then once it exists, can you use it as your little BBs to probe other things and to learn about the structure of nature.
And he did not miss a beat while changing microphones.
So just bear that in mind when you evaluate this session later.
Extra points.
Yeah. So the intriguing thing is that we've actually got in a situation where we've kind of finished the jigsaw puzzle. The standard model of particle physics stands over here now as a kind of complete structure. It hasn't really changed in essence since the mid to late 1970s. And as a consequence of the experimental work that's been done, the evidence that's been accumulated, we've got some sense now that this is in fact the correct structure. But there are issues. Maybe, Brian, you could just give us some sense of what those issues are with the standard model and why it's important to be pushing beyond this current description to try and find something else.
Well, there are a handful of issues, but I think the two most prominent are that we would be thrilled if we could explain every last detail of the standard model itself. So we'd be thrilled if we didn't have to measure the mass of the electron, take that number and put it into the equations, or do that for all the other fundamental particles or the fundamental forces, the weak, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force. We'd love it if we could somehow calculate those numbers. That's one large and very difficult goal, but that's one thing that we'd like to do to go beyond the standard model. The other major feature is that the standard model leaves out the force of gravity. So it discusses all the non-gravitational forces, but of course gravity is among nature's forces. So we want to bring that into the fold. We want to have a description of gravity that can be put in the language of quantum physics, which is the language of the standard model, which is a quantum field theory. So those are sort of the two big challenges that we still have in front of us.
There's one other issue as well that I think is actually worth mentioning, because I want to come on to talk about the other big announcement that was made in March this year concerning a completely different theoretical structure. So on the one hand, as Brian said, you've got the science, the theory of the very small, the elementary fundamental particles that make up everything, make up all material substance. And on the other hand, you've got this theoretical description of the universe as a whole, the very big. Maybe, Peter, you could just share a perspective a little bit on again, where that model has come from and what the significance of these recent results, even though they're somewhat under question at the moment, what that means in terms of the development of this structure.
Well, you know, sometimes you have things that you would like to have in physics, and sometimes there are things that we really have to have. For instance, when quantum mechanics had been developed, special relativity, Einstein's first take on relativity that had to do with constantly moving frames of reference rather than accelerated ones, they had to be made compatible. It wasn't possible to think about quantum mechanics without considering the way things would look at a significant fraction of the speed of light. So that's a unification. It's not the white wall tires. It's, you know, making sure that the car has wheels at all. And it took a long time. When Einstein first talked about a photon in 1905, it was a really outrageous idea. And people, the leading physicists at the time said, this is actually logically incoherent that a particle could be also a wave. How we know that light's a wave. You're saying it's a particle. But that's like saying A and not A. That's crazy. It's a destructive measure. It's the end of science. And in a way, gravity and what we've learned about the particle world have to be made compatible. If you look at small enough regions and black holes and places where energy is dense, the particle world has to enter. So it's not just an option. It may not be given to our generation to get it right, but it's not a question we can ignore. And in the quest for that, it's been very hard to find, through string theory, which is one of the main avenues to try to do that, to find consequences that could be looked at observationally. There are other reasons to look at string theory besides direct consequences, reasons of connecting mathematics and physics, the kind of thing that Brian works on. There are deepening of our understanding of quantum field theory. There are lots of other reasons, but we'd like to see consequences. And this experiment, the one that was conducted at the South Pole, that's looking at, in the primordial, from the beginning of the universe, gravity waves that were emitted by that, should be moving around the primordial soup in ways that will leave a signal that we could see. And there's a candidate signal from that. Whether it's going to turn out to be a lasting signal or whether part or all of it will be accounted for by the dust that's between us and the place that signal originated, that we'll have to see. But somehow in this, we now at least have a place to look at and say, this kind of experiment, this kind of observation could be a way of looking many, many orders of magnitude smaller than the best accelerator we could ever dream of having.
I don't know if you're a gambling man, Brian, but if you had to place money on this, which way do you think it's going to come out?
Well, I'd have to calculate the wave function, square it, get out a probability, determine in Bayesian analysis. No, I'd rather not speak in terms of probabilities, but I think the community's confidence as a general vector is pointing toward it maybe not being as solid as it was initially thought in March. But that is the nature of science, right? People come up with ideas, they do observations, they put it out to the world, and the world tries to smash it to pieces, because that's what we as scientists do. Because only then do you know when you've got something that's solid truth, when it doesn't break.
And I'm guessing that's the reason for the choice of picture behind us. You take a great idea and you test it until it smashes into a million pieces. Is that right?
I think it's a good interpretation.
So the intriguing thing is, so you've got these two structures, the structure of the very small, the structure of the very big, and they don't quite join together. What's missing in the standard model of particle physics is gravity, and gravity is very much what the standard model of Big Bang cosmology is all about. And physicists have been wrestling with the fact that these structures won't join together. They've been wrestling with that problem for quite a long time. There are some other ingredients that I'm not sure how much value there will be in exploring them, but I feel actually rather strongly that the Big Bang model of cosmology actually tells us quite unequivocally that what we take to be the universe actually accounts for about 4% of the total mass energy of that universe. In other words, the universe is mostly missing. That's kind of tragic. But on the other hand, it's a statement of what science is telling us about what it is that we see. Now, a big slice of that missing mass energy comes in the form of something called dark matter. Now, dark matter is necessary. You can't explain the rotational motions of galaxies and clusters of galaxies unless you invoke the existence of something called dark matter. But it's not in the standard model of particle physics, and we have no idea what it is. In terms of the way that contemporary theoretical physics has tackled some of these issues, Brian, and maybe, I know it's impossible to give a kind of potted history of the last 40 years of developments in supersymmetry and string theory, but maybe you could give the audience some sense as to, how theorists have tried to grapple with these problems and the directions they've fixed on.
You mean dark matter, dark energy?
Dark matter, dark energy,
Yep.
but also again this issue of unification. I know that's a big subject, and already we've been talking for 15 minutes. So take your time.
Yeah. So well, for dark matter, the approach that many physicists have taken is to imagine that there might be other particles beyond the ones that we regularly produce in accelerators. And those particles could be, in essence, floating out there in space, not giving off light, not binding together into structures like stars, and in that way giving rise to a gravitational field, but not anything else that's easily discernible. And it just so happens, and this is a kind of remarkable coincidence if it's only a coincidence, it's a remarkable truth if it's actually the way the world works, that an approach to going beyond the standard model of particle physics called supersymmetry, you alluded to it, which has its own theoretical motivations. This theory from, I guess, the early 1980s, it became clear that the additional particles that come from this approach to going beyond the standard model to have a deeper understanding of the relationship between force particles and matter particles, this completely non-oriented toward dark matter theoretical development yields particles that have really just the right properties to be the dark matter, and really in detail. You can do detailed calculations of how many of these particles should remain in the universe since the time of the Big Bang, And without really having to do much work at all, you wind up finding a relic density from the earliest moments of the universe that agrees with what we know should be there based upon observations of rotation curves of galaxies. So again, that doesn't mean that the idea is right. And in fact, data from the Large Hadron Collider has certainly shaken our confidence that supersymmetry, at least low-energy supersymmetry, might be the way nature actually works. So that's the more recent development. But from the historical perspective, I have to tell you, as a student, a graduate student in the 1980s, to see these papers that just use supersymmetry without having to do much work at all, came up with natural dark matter candidates, thrilling. But that doesn't mean it's right.
So I just wanted to give you my perspective on the kinds of, the way that science develops when confronted with these kinds of issues. These are big, big problems. And because these are questions that are fundamentally fascinating to us as human beings, there's a big motivation for one to try and tackle them. We really are very, very keen to know how we kind of fit with the large-scale structure of the universe and what it might mean for, for us and for the way we think about ourselves and the way we kind of put it all together. But what physicists have no choice but to do is in my terms, they cross a line. So there's a structure, it's testable. There's a question of having some patience to wait until the colliders have been built, and so we can make the observations, we can do the experimental work. But in the absence, as we wait for that data to come along, we cross a line, and we have no choice but to speculate. We speculate about what reality might be like. It might be supersymmetric. It might be composed of strings instead of point particles. Whatever it might be, we cross a line. Now, the issue, and again, maybe Peter has an observation on this from his own perspective on the history of science, the issue is to get back across the line with a prediction or with something that vision of reality tells you, that you can then, say, well, then at least I can develop a fundamental yes, no, right, wrong test for that. A perspective on that, maybe?
Well, I was thinking about, as you were speaking, what an analogy might be. One might be that back in the 50s, there was a big debate about cosmology. And was the universe, did it have its source in a Big Bang, a singular moment of explosion, or was, as some people thought, some very smart, good cosmologists, that there was a kind of continuous creation, that every cubic foot of space once in a while would pop a new bit of mass energy into existence. And the advantage of this second, what's called steady state model, was that it got away from what they thought was a too religiously tinted moment of creation. It seemed to them consistent with the idea that every place was just like every other place. It didn't give a single, it didn't pick out a moment in time. Every point in space-time was basically equivalent. That it was always happening, and the universe was expanding, but it was expanding from every point in that way. And in a way, there were things that spoke for the Big Bang theory, but it didn't have a sort of nailed it shut kind of consequence. And then when the folks at Bell Labs discovered that there was this remnant microwave radiation bouncing around, a leftover fossil of the Big Bang, it was really stunning. No one thought there was going to be an observation that was that attached to it. And then over time, with better and better equipment, get more and more detailed pictures of this microwave background and look for fluctuations in it and use it to be able to date precisely the age of the universe and the overall curvature of the universe. And cosmology in the period from Einstein to the present has become a science. And who thought that? That just seemed incredible. It seemed like it was permanently, to use your expression, across the line from science. And now it's become part of observational science. And I think that's the hope among many people in string theory and in some of the subsidiary or attached notions of supersymmetry, is that things that start out satisfying certain theoretical goods will eventually lead to an understanding that connects with what can be observed.
The intriguing thing is that we've reached a stage now where In fact, it's interesting. I had a communication from Steve Weinberg, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1979, for his use of the Higgs mechanism, in effect, to predict the masses of other particles that were subsequently found at CERN in 1983. And he likened the situation, the placing of bets on these theoretical structures, to be like a compulsive gambler who knows that the gaming house is crooked, but he has no alternative than to keep placing his bets in this crooked gaming house because it's the only game in town. So we're in a situation where the theoretical structures that have been developed over the last 30 years or so are kind of perceived by the community as the only game in town. And yet, they still remain distant for us. They still, for me, remain on the other side of the line. And we've yet to find a way to get back to say, okay, now here's the test. Here's the definitive answer to whether this conception we have of reality is right. I don't know if you have a comment, Brian?
Well, I think that's true. We certainly don't, at the moment, have a testable consequence in the sense of something we can actually do. We can, and I think sometimes people don't take this in as fully as they might, within string theory, and again, just to reemphasize Peter's point, the issue of putting gravity in quantum mechanics is not an issue of fanciful choice, or we maybe can do it, maybe we won't do it, we just have to think whether, somehow some aesthetic judgment. No, it's much more than that. The current state of physics is incoherent, fundamentally incoherent. The two structures, right, the standard model that we spoke about, general relativity on the other hand, they do not work together. So I can pose questions to any physicist can do this. I can pose questions, calculate the scattering amplitude of, an electron off an electron, taking into account the gravitational interaction. Do that. These are things that we don't know how to do, and in the standard formulation, the answers we would get would be nonsensical. So we have to figure this out. And there aren't that many approaches that seem capable of doing that. We're working very hard. And if there were other ideas that we could come up with, I assure you, people would pursue them with a vengeance. But at the moment, string theory and another approach, loop quantum gravity, a few other things, dynamical triangulation, there are just a small handful of possibilities. And to many of us, string theory has seemed to be the most compelling of all of those possibilities. And the reason is, well, there are many reasons that one could give, but at least to my mind, one of the most impressive features of string theory is that you don't really put gravity in from the get-go. You start with this description of nature where instead of point particles, you use this language of loops or filaments, and out pops the general theory of relativity. So, I mean, Ed Witten is fond of saying this, and it's in some sense really just meant to make a point, not to talk about anything that one really would imagine. But if history had unfolded differently and somehow string theory was stumbled upon first, smart people would have extracted Einstein's equations from string theory. That is a pretty compelling thing. That doesn't, again, mean that it's right, but it certainly suggests that string theory is embracing discoveries from the past and synthesizing them together. Now, before we can believe it, and this needs to be underscored too, we have to have empirical evidence. We must have some testable, observable consequence. And again, we can make predictions for how particles will scatter in any given string model at very high energies that differ from what we would get in standard quantum field theory. The problem is we can't actually access those energies. We think maybe we'll get lucky, but I doubt it. I don't think we can access those energies. So there are predictions of any given string model. There are definite predictions. Don't say there aren't predictions. There are definite predictions. We just can't get at them. So I think that's a real important distinction to make, because I would not be interested in string theory if somehow it was permanently, again in your language, across some line, where it was totally just impossible to test, not just difficult to test, but impossible, logically impossible to test. I wouldn't be interested. I don't think most people would. But as Peter's saying, there are times when structures can seem to be beyond testability, and we work hard and we're smart, and somehow some genius, maybe not yet born, comes along and says, aha, this is how you do it. And that is the way that interest in a theory that's difficult to test can certainly be kept very strong.
But there are aspects, I think, where this notion of testability are perhaps within boundaries of reach, not quite in the way that Brian's suggesting. It was interesting to observe the kind of reaction to the announcement of the discovery of the Higgs boson in July 2012. Of course, there was joy. The champagne corks were popping. Fantastic. This is the last missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle of the Standard Model. But there was also kind of there was a disheartened reaction. Because the one thing that the Large Hadron Collider at CERN had been able to do was to prove kind of what we already knew, that the Higgs boson must be there because the Higgs field must be there, because without the Higgs field, the Standard Model of particle physics would kind of fall apart. So there was this hope, this optimism, that along with the Higgs boson, there might be some further new physics that would be uncovered in the data. And that actually just didn't happen. Now, the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, it's been taken apart. They're kind of cleaning the spark plugs, ready to put it back together and crank up the energy up to 13 trillion electron volts, not quite double the energy that was needed to see the Higgs. But the question that I think I would have had is that one of the things that we could have expected maybe in the new physics that might have been visible at these energies already were these supersymmetric particles that Brian has mentioned as being candidates, for example, for dark matter particles. And yet they haven't been seen. And the question I've got, how long are we going to keep playing this game, pushing the supersymmetric particles? You know, if we don't see them at this energy, okay, that's because they're there at higher energies. And if we don't see them at a higher energy, oh, that's because they're at even higher energies. How long do we keep playing this game until we then put our hands in the air and say, okay, so maybe this is not the way nature works?
I mean, how long are we going to consider to think about reality? I don't know what the question is.
Oh. Of course, we will never stop thinking about reality, but maybe there are different ways of thinking about reality.
But these pursuits are not stopping people from doing that.
Nope.
I assure you.
Nope.
People are pursuing various ideas, and oftentimes, and Peter can talk to the history of this more than I can, but developments in one area, even if they don't yield the answer, can often give you something to shoot for, give you a spark that sends you in a given direction. You know, even with inflationary cosmology, it turns out that, who knows, maybe it's right, maybe it's not. We don't really know. But certainly the state of cosmology before inflationary theory was completely chaotic. People didn't know what to really do. It wasn't even that there wasn't a theory. They didn't really know where the focus should be. And then you have this wonderful conference, the Nuffield Workshop, where people calculate the temperature variations in the microwave background radiation that should have come to be if inflation was correct. All of a sudden, everybody had something to shoot for. The experimenter, the observers had something to look for. The theorists had calculations to refine. And even if it turns out to be wrong, I'm sure this will be a vital move in the direction of the right cosmological theory. So I think you have to take into account that people do the best that they can. And you know, I think that one good place that is worthwhile as a starting point for all these conversations, not that you've suggested otherwise, but physicists are people who are honestly seeking the truth. Honestly seeking the truth. Why else would we do this? I tell you, it's not for the money, right? There are other things that we could do if we wanted to be rich, right? And it's not this, right? So you spend your life honestly in the pursuit of what you deem to be the most promising pathway toward truth. And some of us have spent part of our lives working on this approach called string theory. And some people have done other things. And I'm thrilled that they've done other things because that's what the health of science is about.
You know, an analogy, historical analogy that's not from the very distant past, was when Weinberg and Glashow and Salam made their theory in 1967 that unified the weak and electrodynamic forces. They more or less dropped it for 4 years. Between 67 and 71, none of them were that. It was an idea. They wrote it down, published the papers, went on to other things. And then in 1971, Tufte published a very arcane paper. I mean, but hard to read paper by the standards of modern techniques, that showed that the theory was renormalizable, which meant that it gave finite answers in a provable way. And suddenly, Weinberg became reinterested in his own theory, and he called up Carlo Rubbia, experimentalist, and said, "You know that experiment you're working on at Fermilab, which was designed for a completely different they built that to a complicated apparatus. It was built to look for the W, one of the particles that was discovered in 1983, at an energy that's nowhere near. It was like looking for 42nd Street in London. It just wasn't there. So so suddenly they reorganized the experiment that had been built for a completely different purpose, for an accelerator that was built for a completely different purpose, and they found the evidence that the electroweak theory was on the right track, the weak neutral currents. And I think there's lots of examples of that. When Reines was working on the thermonuclear weapon, the Mike test, this enormous, 500 times bigger than Hiroshima bomb that was being set off in the Pacific, he said, "You know what? You know that neutrino that goes through millions of Earths without interacting? I think we can find it next to a hydrogen bomb." And then he thought, well, maybe it'd be easier to do it near a nuclear reactor. And they did it, and they found it. Nobody thought you were going to find a neutrino. I mean, that seemed like crazy talk. But there was enough of them there that you could actually make these enormous vats of cleaning fluid, essentially, and find these things. So I think sometimes the empirical consequence may come from someplace we don't expect.
Sure.
Saying that we'd have to build an accelerator bigger than, the galaxy. That's not the way we're going to find it. We're going to find, if there's going to be consequences, it's going to come out of nowhere, or out of the successor experiment to Bicep 2, if Bicep 2 turns out to be dusty.
And that's understood, but if you look back at the history of development in theoretical physics, there have been instances in the past where wrong bets have been made. Theorists have gone in this direction only to get hauled back by some new experimental result to say, okay, so nature doesn't work the way that we thought it was.
As I go further, I'd say the vast majority of the ideas that we have are wrong. Not that someone made a mistake. It's just very hard to figure out nature. Yeah. So most of the ideas that you're going to put forward are going to not lead where you hope they're going to lead. That's just the nature of the game.
And the issue that I guess that we're grappling with and dealing with, and you got the impression now I do have an opinion about the direction that we're going, is this a gamble that is going to pay off? Is this a gamble that's not going to pay off? Have we taken a wrong turn?
But if we knew the answer to that, it wouldn't be a gamble. I mean
sure.
that's the whole nature of high-risk science, right? I mean, you take a chance.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to take it, that's cool. Do something else.
But the issue is that when the evidence doesn't stack in your favor, and let's be clear, with the evolution of supersymmetry, guys were already saying that we should be seeing evidence for supersymmetric particles already in the 1990s,
yes.
Even late 1980s. And these things haven't been seen. So the game has been to say, well, let's at least preserve this structure by pushing things out. In a way, by the way, that actually now invalidates, I think, what supersymmetry was intended to do in the first place. So the question I've got really that I'm still grappling with, and I understand where everyone is coming from in this, and I'm sympathetic. These are still problems that are fundamentally interesting to us because they're trying to address these big questions that we have it's kind of in our DNA. We want to know the answers to these questions as best we can articulate them. But the question is, at what point do we say, okay, we need to stop and have a rethink here? We need to. I got a quote from Einstein, which I've held onto as a kind of guiding light. Einstein was a great guy, as we all know, and he said time and again, the passion for understanding has led to the illusion that man is able to comprehend the objective world rationally by pure thought without any empirical foundations. In other words, by metaphysics. And the question is, how do we now get back from the metaphysics of contemporary theoretical physics and have some hope, other than optimism, that this is a gamble that's going to pay off?
Not to be difficult, but I don't really understand the question. So, I guess my view is we don't need to answer the question, when is enough as a community? I think that's at the level of the individual. You know, we have people called physicists who devote their lives to physics, and the reason they're able to do physics typically is because they're in a university where they have a job. And the reason they have a job is because they've done something, or a number of things, that the community as a whole has deemed sufficiently valuable that that individual is deemed worthy of making their own decisions about what they want to pursue. And that's really important. And we can't ever try to take that away. So the individual will look at all the things that you're talking about with greater scrutiny than even you're giving it, because it's our lives, right? It might be, you know, something that, you know, many people are interested in, but if you're devoting your life to it, you really think about it all the time. Is this something that I want to give up? And there are a number of people who look at the failure to find supersymmetry and have given it up. And some, in fact, some have given up physics, not just shifted to another area. So what you're talking about does happen at the level of the individual. And yes, sometimes we get together, you know, we'll talk about it as a group. It's not that we can't do that, but the final decision about what to work on has to be left in the hands of people who have shown that they've got the ability and the judgment to make real progress in physics. And I think that's that. Okay, thank you. I've got to go now, and see you later.
There's another interesting dimension, and I will raise it, and then I think what we'll do is we'll stop the discussion and hand over to you guys to just ask the three of us some questions. Intriguingly, given the status and the nature of these theoretical constructions and the fact that they are unproven, and we can have a debate about whether they can ever be proven given the limitations that we have in terms of building particle accelerators and making observations of the universe. But it's quite clear that despite the nature of the status of these theoretical structures, and irrespective of Brian's point that it's up to the individual to make their choices as to how they're going to spend their intellectual energies in the future, what we've seen in the last couple of years is that there are nevertheless tremendous financial rewards for people who are prepared to commit themselves to this kind of endeavor. $3 million prizes. And the issue then starts to become, okay, so, and against that background, given that it's a question of individual choice and okay, I choose where I'm going to spend my time and my energy, is this kind of thing, is this kind of reward structure now starting to distort the nature of the way in which we try to do science and we try to do physics as a whole?
Maybe Peter, you can answer, but I've never encountered a single individual whose choices of what they work on has ever been motivated by the chance to win one of these rare awards. I've never encountered anyone who says, yeah, I really want to work on that, but this one, you know, has a chance. Maybe I'll get the Milner, maybe I'll get the, you know, no, I've just never seen it. People are passionate to work toward the truth, and that's the community that I know.
No, I mean, I think one example of an attempt to make a community or institutionalized decision about direction in the United States. In other countries, it's been more directed. But here in the 50s, there was a moment when the Physical Review said, you know, all this talk about the interpretation of quantum mechanics, enough. I know Bohr did it. We know Einstein did it, but it's like, we're going to ban it. We're not going to publish interpretive articles. But people went on and worked on this anyway and got involved with really trying to think hard about the foundations of quantum mechanics. And it actually led to all sorts of incredibly important, now what you'd call the technology of quantum mechanics. Not the use of quantum mechanics to build better transistors, but really the strange effects of quantum mechanics, that the things that were only in the realm of the interpretive world, you know, things like quantum money or quantum encryption or quantum teleportation. I mean, these things are now being worked on with great excitement and in very interesting results all over the place. And so I think I would, if there was the option of having a directive from on high that said, you know, we will not publish any more articles in a certain area, I'd be very loath to do that. That's a way too authoritarian and in general not a productive thing. What if a program becomes genuinely unproductive, what displaces it is a better idea in the end. You know, when Einstein was writing, most physicists of his caliber had this view that there was unification to be had. He had by understanding the ether. The ether was going to explain what particles were. You were going to have things like smoke rings in the ether, self-sustaining vortical flows that were an electron, for example. And you would look at scattering like you'd scatter smoke rings, or you'd have, and there were a lot of really interesting work around this. And thinking about the ether led Maxwell to think about what's known as the displacement current, which was his fundamental contribution that led to radio waves and television and all sorts of good stuff. But Einstein, famously in 1905, has a little sentence on the front page of his paper that says the luminiferous ether will turn out to be a superfluous concept. And with that little flick off his shoulder, sort of ended the careers of most of his contemporaries. That's what stopped them from this nobody second-class patent clerk in Switzerland, said not interesting what most of these guys were spending their lives doing. Now, if someone comes up with a great new idea over time, and it took a lot of time, but it became more productive to think about things his way, even though Lorentz and Poincare came up with equations quite similar to what Einstein had, but thinking of it through the ether. But eventually, it became felt as natural to think of it Einstein's way. So maybe something like that will happen. Maybe the equations of string theory will be reinterpreted in some way and given another perspective that leads it down another path. But it won't come from the National Science Foundation's directorate.
Thank goodness. So let's just pick up a couple of threads. While we wait for another Einstein to come along and transform the landscape of theoretical physics with a shot off the shoulder, or however you put it, Peter, I'd just like to leave you with a thought. I'd like to, again, give you another quote. This is from a book review. It was a review of a book called The Cosmological Anthropic Principle. It's a review published in 1987 by a Danish historian, Helge Krag. He was quite critical of this book because of what it represented for him. And this is what he said. This kind of escapist physics, also cultivated by authors like Wheeler, Sagan, and Dyson, appeals to the religious instinct of man in a scientific age. Whatever its merits, it should not be accepted uncritically or because of the scientific brilliancy of its proponents. And I just leave you maybe with that thought. We are in the area of asking fundamentally big questions, and we are innately interested as mankind in getting hold of the answers. And irrespective of whether we think the directions are right or wrong, the fact that you are involved in asking these questions and dealing in some way with the provision of some kind of answers is maybe too alluring to be a decision that you just say on the basis of whether there's money in it or not, on the basis of whether there's a scientific career to be built or not. There is going to be a profile of individual that's going to be drawn to this activity. Don't take it uncritically. The status of some of these contemporary theories is not like the status of the standard model of particle physics, or even, I would argue, the inflationary model of Big Bang cosmology. We'll have a debate about the inflationary bit. But bear in mind, this is about evidence in the natural sciences, and we're reaching a stage now in the development of physics where we are beginning to ask fundamentally searching questions about, well, what now constitutes evidence? Okay, so I think that's enough. Final comments from Brian or Peter?
Nope.
Nope. So questions? Yeah, we have a few. Do you want to use the little microphone?
Yeah, earlier today we had a nice conference here, and there was a lot of talk about the good news and the bad news, and the fact that the good news. I have to talk into it. The good news. Yeah, that's good. The good news gets a lot of airplay. The bad news, the negative evidence, doesn't get a lot. So we've got 5 sigma that say that there's a Higgs out there. Yay, they're popping quarks. I understand that the anomalous magnetic moment of the muon is out by 3 sigma. Don't see much press on that. How are we doing with that lately?
Here I have to look at my esteemed panel.
But the question is, why does the press pick up on one kind of thing and not another? Well, I don't know. Maybe to balance all the other negative reporting they do in the rest of the newspaper. I don't know. Dennis Overby. I don't know. Is he here? He'd be a better person to answer that question. But I think all of these things should be out there. Look, why do we do the World Science Festival, right? We do it to get all of the ideas in play, not just the ones that are necessarily attracting attention, say, in the newspaper. We have a discussion, right after this, which is why I'm going to have to sort of leave right at time. We're doing a discussion about BICEP 2. And we have people on there who think BICEP 2 results are right, namely John Kovac himself. And then we got folks on there who think it's not right. And both are part of the program. So I have a platform for both perspectives. So I just would like science to be covered more fully across the board. I've never noticed sort of a conspiracy toward one kind of result. But yes, when I'm thinking about it, sure. If people are excited about something, it makes for a better article. It sells more newspapers. So ultimately, it's about business, I presume. But from the point of view of science, yeah, it all should be out there. We should all be talking about these things. Bottom line is, most people aren't talking about any of this.
Okay, very good. Question over here. So again, if you could use the microphone in your seat.
So it's kind of a follow-up on that one, but in a different vein. I was kind of thinking about how doubt is exploded in the media about science across the board. So in science, there's this, we need to know with 100% certainty that something actually exists to say it, but in the public, that's deemed as like uncertainty and like casting doubt. So how do scientists sort of resolve that idea between public's understanding of a theory or et cetera and our understanding?
There was a moment in the debates over tobacco and its dangers that began 50 years ago, where the tobacco industry in one of their conclaves said that we really ought to say not that tobacco smoking is great for you, which some people had said, or had no relationship to your health. They'd said that too. But instead said, you know what we really need is just more doubt. And in fact, there's a document that they had that said, doubt is our product. And they went around and they pushed the idea that let's just spend another 10 years doing more research to figure out if tobacco is bad for you. And then a lot of those people, same publicity firms, same advertising agencies, went on to say, maybe we can do the same thing with climate change. And would just say, look, we're not saying there's no climate change. We're not saying there's climate change. Let's just do more research. And this has gone on for years and years. So the doubt in the public isn't just something that sprang up one day like a mushroom under the rainy tree, but has been cultivated for certain purposes. And I think that's been very destructive. There was no reason that the dangers of tobacco needed to take so long to get out there. People wanted that doubt. And I think that scientists this time around on climate change have been much more forceful in many different countries, and the international agencies and research projects that have been studying it have really tried to be clear about the broad scientific consensus that there isn't a doubt about climate change and its human origin in the scientific community. That doubt is created on television commentators and pundits and made to look like the debate when it's actually, among scientists, not a debate.
The issue is that I think that there's a real, if you're working inside science, you know how science kind of works, or often how it doesn't in many cases. And I think the issue here is the wider public's perception is that science is yes or no, or black and white. And science really isn't like that. I mean, the chances are you come through with a startling new theory, it gets proven with experimental data, there will always be doubt. There will always be dissenting voices, and quite often something becomes accepted as the right way of looking at things when those that are arguing against it die. And they're gone.
But like, how do you preserve like the part of the community that values that debate, right, without creating that field of doubt? I guess that's.
You know, as a scientist, you learn to live with doubt. Doubt is sort of the essential experience that you have. I mean, look, we've been talking about a variety of things from climate change to Baggott, but I mean, just go back to string theory for a second. Do I doubt string theory? Hugely so. How could anybody not? You have to doubt every single theory until it reaches the level of having observational support or experimental evidence. That doesn't mean that it's wrong, though. It doesn't mean that it's not worthy of deep exploration. So you live with that doubt. That doubt can actually fuel you because that is the lifeblood. Because surely if we figured out string theory, and let's say it turned out to be right or wrong, it doesn't really matter, we'd be on to the next thing, where we'd be uncertain, because that's what it means to be at the frontier. If you're not uncertain, you're not doing cutting-edge work. So from the perspective of a scientist, that's what it's all about. But yes, getting it out there in the public in a way that accurately reflects the true scientific perspective on an idea, which is nuanced. It's not black or white. It is maybe. We have some reason to suspect it might be going in the right direction. It's our best idea to solve this important problem. We're led to it through mathematical consistency. Because look, I should say, you can rule a theory out without data. Theory can rule out a theory. That's the beauty of a theoretical structure. It can implode if it isn't built right. But you can't give evidence for a theory from the theory. That has to come from the world, and that can be challenging.
Okay, good. I think we're going to be kept quite busy with some more questions. So your hand was up a little earlier, if you don't mind. Yeah.
There's this other question going on in the background through a lot of the discussion, which is, what does it take in order to keep a scientist working in a theoretical domain when they're not convinced?
Yes.
And so it looks like part of the answer is, well, you've got to have a theoretical explanation which is such that if it were true, it would explain lots and lots of stuff that people are trying to explain. What more does it take than that? That it's testable? Well, no, not that, because she admitted that there are lots of...
Or at least in principle, I would say testable. In other words, were you to, again, show me that this notion you guys have been working on, here's a proof that it is logically impossible to ever test it, my interest in it would drop hugely.
It doesn't have to actually be testable. There needs to be some imaginable condition under which you can test it. And yet it looks like, well, so I'm just going to give you three types of cases which look like they fall on some kind of spectrum. But it looks like they satisfy these different criteria, and yet some people would take seriously and some they wouldn't. So string theory is one.
Yep.
Many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is another.
Yep.
Immaterial souls are another. So is there a difference between these things in principle?
I'll give a quick answer, and then Peter, you can give yours. The string theory one, I think we sort of discussed a little bit. For the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, well, quantum mechanics as a structure has a huge amount of empirical support. The many worlds tries to answer a particular puzzle in quantum mechanics called the quantum measurement problem, which you know well. And we've been struggling to resolve that issue for a long time. So that's not so much an issue of theory versus data, it's theory coherence. Does the theory actually make sense? And the Copenhagen approach to quantum mechanics is incoherent. It is simply incoherent. Yet it makes predictions that we can test. We don't really know what we're doing in the Copenhagen approach. It's not a full theory. Because at the active measurement, the theory shuts down and says, I don't know what's going on here, but just follow this algorithm. That's not a theory. Now, there are ways to make the Copenhagen approach not incoherent. GRW theory, you actually put a collapse postulate in, you change the mathematics. Bohmian mechanics, you put a new equation so you actually know what's going on during a measurement. Many worlds approach, is that coherent? We don't yet know. So if that really were coherent, then I would take it quite seriously, even though I can't actually access these other worlds because of the empirical support for the package of quantum mechanics, and this would just be another component. When it comes to immaterial souls, the reason why I would take that a little less seriously is because it doesn't naturally emerge from any of my understanding of physical theories that have been confronted by data, right? String theory emerges from the desire to put quantum mechanics and general relativity together, two structures that have been tested to fantastic accuracy. It can't be that they're incompatible. How do you put them together? String theory is a potential solution. That motivates me to take it seriously. Quantum mechanics I take seriously because of all the support for it. If you could give me a chain of reasoning that starts with observation and experiment and inevitably leads to immaterial souls, I would take it seriously. I assure you I would take it seriously.
Peter, you have any understanding of the history of the theory of immaterial souls that can contribute to this discussion?
I'll take a pass on that one. But it seems to me one thing we haven't talked about much, which is that there are, in the course of pursuing theories, including quantum field theory or central force laws, people looked at, what if gravity wasn't 1 over r squared, but 1 over r.2.001. I mean, there are variations, and there are an infinite number of quantum field theories. There are an infinite number of other kinds of theories, but they didn't lead to any very interesting structures. They didn't lead to any changes really much in the way we do our mathematics, the way we understand the relationship of things previously thought to be unrelated. And string theory has. And I think when you ask the question, why do people continue working, one of the things is there's a hope that eventually it will, in fact, come to resolve these mandatory unification between the quantum world and the gravity world. One of them is that we hope that it'll eventually lead to an empirical success, whether it's of the bicep 2 variety in a successor generation or something else that we haven't thought of yet. But also along the way, it's yielded a transformation in the relationship of physics and mathematics. It's led to new intuitions about central areas of mathematics that is, I think, unprecedented since the time of Newton and Leibniz. That is to say, there have been times when physics has led to new discoveries that were interesting to mathematicians, but they haven't been deeply generative at the heart of mathematics. Calculus was. And string theory's had that, and that's been very exciting to people, that somehow it feels like it's on to something. Whereas exploring endless varieties of quantum field theories hasn't been, unless it's been focused rather tightly on realizable experimental consequences, it hasn't had that feature. So even when people criticized Einstein for being too mathematical, the mathematics that he was using, differential geometry, was not new with Einstein. He got one of his friends to teach him this work that Levi-Civita and others had done some decades earlier, and it was very much in advance of what other physicists generally knew. But general relativity didn't contribute fundamentally to that branch of mathematics. Whereas this is different, and I think that the insights that those mathematical tools have developed and the way they've connected different domains of physics, for instance, what goes on when, in accelerators when you bash heavy ions together. I mean, it's led to insights and tools and theoretical understandings that have had consequences elsewhere. Sometimes it gets called applied string theory, but it's not taking, Planck scale energies and applying it. It's using the insights of tools and structures and ways of calculation and insights to bring to other areas. And I think those have represented some breadcrumbs on the way, too, that have kept people engaged in a way they wouldn't have been had they been absent.
My only observation on that is that it's one thing to say here's a whole body of theoretical work that can have applications in maybe heavy ion physics or in solid state physics. That's a heck of a lot less interesting and doesn't make headlines than here's a theoretical structure that's telling us about the fundamental nature of the universe. So agreed, these developments can find applications and uses across the board. Why wouldn't they? Why not where there's applicability? But let's be clear, the fundamental driver for the development of these theories is not to do some interesting stuff in solid-state physics. I think that's not what's motivating string theory.
Mathematical structures have been a driver, I think.
Sure. I think we have time for, honestly, guys, one more question. Okay, one more question. There's a young man right in the middle there that, why not, let's have a...
This is a good one.
Yeah.
Just one on a big note. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Well, there's three of us. You can both go simultaneously. Right?
Sorry, can you start again?
You were talking about like the variance in quantum field theory and how like theories have many different variants. You had also been talking about like the different variants of string theory in the elegant universe. I was wondering if they had anything to do with each other.
I missed the first half of the question. Sorry, I can just...
You were talking about like the different you were talking about like the different variations of quantum field theory.
Yeah, and how that relates. Yes. So there are a number of ways of addressing. That's a good question, but the most straightforward one would simply be this. So one of the challenges in string theory that I raise in the elegant universe as one of the big problems, one of the big challenges is string theory can give rise to many different descriptions of the universe. It doesn't, at the moment, with our current understanding, give rise to one unique prediction for what the world should be like at energies that we can access, say with a Large Hadron Collider. The math allows for many, many different possibilities. And in fact, people have made estimates of how many different possibilities there might be, and the numbers have grown over time. When I was a young graduate student, it was, a handful, 5, 10, 15 different possibilities. So you just imagine studying them all, see if any of them agree with the world. But then as the years went by, very clever physicists and mathematicians found other low-energy worlds emerging from the equations of string theory, and it grew into the millions of possibilities, the billions of possibilities, and today the number that's tossed around without a whole lot of justification, but with numbers this big, it hardly matters if you're off by a little bit. 10 to the 500 is the number that people quote for the different possible low-energy worlds, accessible worlds that can emerge from string theory. Now, some people look at that and they're like, that's like nonsense. It's time to move on if there's 10 to the 500 different possibilities. But to answer your question, if you go to quantum field theory, which is the very structure that we hold up as the gold standard, the standard model of particle physics, the quantum field theory, if you count how many quantum field theories there are, well, you can count until the cows come home, because it's infinite. There are infinitely many different quantum field theories. So that notion that somehow you shouldn't think about string theory because it has the possibility of accommodating many, many different accessible worlds, that kind of reasoning would have tossed out quantum field theory from the get-go. What do you do in quantum field theory? You make measurements, and the measurements allow you to winnow down the possibilities and come to the standard model of particle physics. In principle, that same kind of process could happen in string theory. It's just a lot harder. It's much harder, as Peter was saying, the link between the fundamental equations and the things that we observe, the chain between them is much more difficult to navigate, to mix my metaphors here. And that's why it makes it very difficult to just go from observation to, yeah, that's the string theory. But in principle, it's a soluble problem that one day we may crack.
And on that optimistic note, I think we probably should call it a day, guys. Okay, could you please show your thanks to both Brian and Peter?